Welcome everyone to this webinar, Disembarking to Danger, How Australia's Airport Asylum Policies Risk Returning Refugees to Harm. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from Western Australia, and I'm on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge Noongar elders, past and present, and I also acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate each and every one of you for tuning into such an important discussion. Now, over the past few decades, there's been a concerning trend that has made it more difficult to apply for asylum at Australian airports. Though carried out with less fanfare than stopping the boats, these airport policies appear to have similar effect, preventing legitimate asylum seekers from lodging protection claims in Australia. So asylum seekers are currently being turned away at Australian airports pre-COVID and sent back to countries where they may be at risk of serious harm after being interviewed behind closed doors and without access to lawyers. I've reported on the absolute worst case scenarios of this policy. Young Saudi women who've been turned away at Sydney Airport. And today we are privileged enough to have someone with us who will speak from their own personal first-hand experience of what this process is like. So how does this happen? Is it legal? And how does COVID-19 offer Australia the opportunity to fashion a fairer, better airport asylum process for those who can safely fly in? And what urgent changes do we need to make as we wait to reopen our international border? This event today is hosted by the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law, an independent research centre on forced migration issues at UNSW in Sydney. The Centre is a rigorous, credible and non-partisan source of information on refugee issues. And in this respect, and because we are joined today by the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs and Immigration, it is worth noting that the organisers did invite the Acting Minister for Immigration, Alan Tudge, to participate in this important discussion, but he declined to do so. So I'd really like to welcome who we do have here today. Joining us is Regina Jefferies. She's a Scientia PhD scholar at the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law and the co-author of the policy brief recently published by the Kaldor Centre, which I highly recommend everyone read. There's a brilliant video that goes along with it as well. And this brief is called Assessing Protection Claims at Airports, Developing Procedures to Meet International and Domestic Obligations. And it was co-authored by Daniel Gazelbash and Asher Hirsch. We are also lucky enough today to have Senator Kristina Keneally join us. She's a Senator for New South Wales, the Deputy Labor Leader in the Senate, Shadow Minister for Home Affairs and Shadow Minister for Immigration and Citizenship. A former member of the New South Wales Parliament, Senator Keneally was the Premier of New South Wales and the first woman to hold that office. She joined the Federal Senate in 2018 and has held her current portfolio since June last year. And we're very privileged to have Sultan join us today. He is a Saudi journalist who arrived in Australia by plane and claimed asylum last year. Now, Sultan is not his real name, it's a pseudonym because he's still waiting for a decision on his asylum claim. So before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. We will have a 40-minute chat, moderated discussion, followed by time for audience questions. So please have yours ready. And audience members are welcome to post their questions in the Q&A chat session, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Now, to begin, Regina, we wanted to start with you. So many of us are familiar with Australia's tough on boat stance, but can you help to put this policy on asylum seekers arriving by plane into context for us, please?
Yeah, thanks, Sophie, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So when it comes to seeking asylum in Australia, there's obviously and rightly been a significant focus on boat arrivals and offshore processing. And a lot of the rhetoric around that has been in terms of stopping people from making dangerous journeys and preventing unnecessary deaths at sea. But in order to reach Australia, you have to either travel by boat or by plane. And so the issue of plane arrivals, at least prior to the pandemic, has sort of led to some debate about the number of people applying for protection after leaving the airport, how that protection system functions, et cetera. And so millions of people fly into Australia every year for a variety of legitimate reasons, but In terms of the cohort of people that this policy brief actually addresses is a specific subset of people that seek protection after arriving in Australia by plane, and they're seeking protection at the airport. So they're actually raising their protection claim at or before what's called immigration clearance in the airport. And the vast majority of people who arrive in that manner, like Sultan, have gone through the process of applying for and receiving a visa, and are suddenly sort of thrust into this system that actually doesn't, it's not reflected in legislation. It's actually a policy that is currently in effect, but it's unclear how consistently that policy is actually implemented. And so the current...
Could you explain that policy, entry screening? That's what it all comes down to. What does that mean in practice?
Exactly. So entry screening essentially in practice means that someone who arrives at the airport and in Sydney, for example, and they speak to an immigration official, if they indicate or the official arrives at some indication that the person might ask for protection, they're routed through what's called an entry screening process, which actually prioritizes the question of whether the person's visa should be canceled because they would have arrived on some other type of visa. That in itself, so whether the visa is canceled, if the visa is canceled, and it often is, the person is then subject to mandatory detention. And what is supposed to happen is that the person's claim is supposed to be pre-screened by an official at the Department of Home Affairs. It's unclear whether that happens in every case. And it's also unclear as to sort of how that entire system works in every single case. But we do know that people don't receive the ability to appeal a negative decision. So someone will either be screened in and allowed to apply for a temporary protection visa, or they'll be screened out and returned to another country without having a chance to lodge a protection application and without having a chance to appeal that determination.
So it's a punitive policy which really emphasises enforcement over protection. Senator Keneally, what responsibilities does Australia have towards people who arrive by plane and seek asylum?
Yeah, thank you, Sophie, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Particularly, thanks Sultan and for joining us, and really for the opportunity to speak with you. Look, this is an incredibly important issue, and it's one that I've been seeking to raise and have had a great chance to talk to Regina previously about the surge in asylum claims on shore. Now, of course, I think we all know that Australia is signatory to a number of conventions, and we should be, of course, abiding by those. The fact that I even have to say that sentence, though, does indicate that there are real issues when it comes to processing asylum seekers, whether it is onshore, offshore, or through airplane arrival, the airplane arrivals process, to ensure that we are providing legal rights and due process. I think we'll unpack a bit of this throughout the webinar today, but certainly some of the suggestions that Regina makes in her paper are fundamental, sound, and are things that the government should be doing and putting in place. I am particularly concerned about whether or not people have access to adequate legal representation, adequate translators and support, as well as rights of review when decisions are made. Further, I'm concerned, and I think Regina's paper points this out, the extent to which there are competent staff making appropriate assessment level decisions when a claim is first lodged. And the processes that are laid out in Regina's paper, as I said, are ones that are really quite important. Now, I know we may get into this a bit more, Sophie, but I just think to give people a sense of the scale of the issue or the scale of the challenge we're talking about, is that there have been since 2013 almost 125,000 people who have arrived on shore through airports and lodged claims for asylum protection. And I raise that number because it has gone up year on year on year since 2013. And the reason I raise it is this, because this is partly what is contributing to the problem that we have. We have had increasing numbers of onshore claims for protection. A large majority of those are not legitimate claims for onshore protection, but rather an organized work scam being run out of a couple countries. And we can get into that.
Yeah, because it is quite a separate issue. This is about the entry screening. Yeah.
But I only make this point here because if the system is overwhelmed by tens of thousands, indeed over 100,000 applications, it makes it far more difficult to have the robust, thorough, credible, and legal processes that are required to assess genuine claims of refugee status that are being lodged by people when they do arrive by plane.
I think we probably all agree that that whole system is broken and desperately needs urgent changes across it. But just on this point of the entry screening process, I mean, I think there's a very strong case to argue that it is not legal, this policy, and that it doesn't have a basis in domestic law or in legislation. Do you consider it legal, Senator, this entry screening policy?
Look, I'm not probably going to make a judgment on that because I'm not qualified to. But I would say that I'm highly concerned about its legality. And Labor has raised in the past our concerns about several aspects of the government's current policies when it comes to asylum claims, whether it is on board boats, at airports, or otherwise, when it comes to its legality and its accordance with our responsibilities under various UN conventions. What I would say is that the process itself would be massively aided by clear legislative requirements upon the government and the participation early on in the process where people have of legal advice, where people have access to sound legal advice. I think when I look across the whole of the system and the number of cases that are overwhelming the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, Refugee and Migration Division, it is often, you look at it and you realize these are often things that could have been resolved much earlier if people had access to legal advice.
Before we move on to Sultan's personal story, Regina, could you just talk us through exactly why this policy, you believe, it doesn't have any basis in domestic law and is potentially illegal?
Sure. So the idea behind this policy essentially, and I don't want to get sort of too much into the weeds here in terms of that, but essentially the rationale behind this policy is around an inquiry into whether Australia's non-refoulement obligations are engaged. And this is, as I said, a policy, it's not legislation. What's interesting is that Australia, the Parliament has actually put into place a section of law that says that non-refoulement will actually not be a primary consideration in determining whether someone should be removed from Australia. So there's this really
breaks our international legal obligations, doesn't it?
Exactly, which is not in line with international law. But it's this really interesting sort of have your cake and eat it too corner that the policy seems to suggest, is that, well, how can this policy be about seeing if someone engages Australia's non-refoulement obligations before they're removed, if those obligations aren't a consideration in removal in the first place? The other part of this is that Australia's protection system, the protection framework, is actually set up specifically to identify people who may need Australia's protection. There's an entire legal framework for that, which actually allows people to lodge an application for protection in immigration clearance, which is the sort of zone at the airport where this is meant to be happening. So to the extent that the policy suggests that people are not allowed to lodge a protection application at immigration clearance in the airport, that's really problematic. And Senator Keneally actually made a number of important points. And one of those is in terms of people having access to quality legal advice. It's absolutely critical for someone who is required to lodge an application either by mail or online. First of all, well, that becomes a bit difficult when you're being held at the airport or an alternative place of detention like a hotel. So access to these services and to the ability to actually lodge an application becomes really, really critical in this process.
Now, Sultan is with us today. He's actually been through this entry screening process. Sultan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you all.
Well, we're so glad you're here. And I was fascinated to learn that before you arrived in Australia, you used to watch the program Border Security. But
Yes.
that couldn't have prepared you for what happened when you touched down at Sydney Airport last year on a tourist visa. Tell us, Sultan, talk us through what happened when you first arrived.
Well, just let me backtrack a little bit before that stage. Is that in Saudi we had some problems, my partner and I, due to journalism work I did with various major networks, including Canadian television, which is the straw that broke the camel's back. I was called into a prison on the outskirts of Riyadh by our state security services, and basically, make a long story short, told that if I did not stop working with the foreign media, then I would be outed, and my relationship with my partner would be outed basically to his family and mine. I was a good boy. I didn't work with the media for a few months, but then, when you end up almost destitute, I continued working, at which point the government did go ahead and tell my partner's family about us, at which point we had to run from Saudi Arabia because his family is a huge, very powerful family. We wanted to go to Canada initially, partly because I have many friends there, and Canada was their state channel did get me in trouble, so I figured I had a chance. Make a long story short, we applied for Canadian visas. My partner wasn't given a visa simply because he had a brand new passport with no stamps in it at all from previous travel. So he found that Australia gave Saudis instant visas, and he did that through a simple online search. And I think that's where the problem begins. Australia gives Saudis instant visas, and I think that explains part of the reason that so many Saudis are coming to Australia. But once you arrive here and you're about 20 meters away from the airport doors to go out into Sydney, that's when you get stopped at that nice place that I've seen on TV a dozen times in Saudi Arabia through Border Force. But Border Force never showed you the asylum seeker process. They just showed you people with apples and food and fruits and stuff.
So you didn't have any apples, but they pitched you as potentially being an asylum seeker, which was correct, but you weren't given a chance to seek a lawyer or to go through any evidence you might have to substantiate that claim. Talk us through what they first said to you, Sultan, and how you felt in that moment.
Well, we had valid visas when we arrived. With the first, we had our passports checked, and then they told us to grab our luggage. At which point we went through the customs hall, and Border Force stopped us. There was maybe 300 people on that flight. It was December 12th. And it was October 12th when we arrived last year. So it was just my partner and I. We went through the customs hall, and these ABF people stopped us and separated us. And they asked us what our purpose for our visit to Australia was, at which point I didn't really want to tell them that I'm an asylum seeker because I didn't know what to expect. The plan was to get into Sydney, get in touch with Human Rights Watch or UNHCR or immigration attorneys or the gay community. That was the plan. I wanted to get advice before starting the process, but we were not given that option because at the airport, we were like, no, we're going to go see the Opera House, or we're going to go, do whatever people do in Sydney. Obviously, their experience, they didn't buy that. So they decided that they would tell us that they needed to take our phones from us, which is something I'd never even heard of happening. Not
and you
in
were
South.
Separated as well from your partner.
I could see him. We could nod to each other. If I raised my voice, we could hear each other and speak to each other. But they basically didn't want us talking to one another. So at which point they took our phones away. They made us unlock our phones, and they asked us who we knew in Australia. And I told them, look, I have a friend of mine. She's with CBS News. Her name is Holly. Holly. I'm not going to use her last name. And at which point they checked the chats that I had with Holly and with other Australian friends that I had here. And after 20 minutes, they came back out to the customs halls with our phone and told us quite seriously now, I could tell there was a change in attitude, that they believed we were going to seek asylum. At which point I said, yes, we do need asylum here. Then they really separated us now, took us to two separate rooms, interview rooms, with phones on the desk and translators ready. At which point they asked us back and forth for about 4.5 hours what our story was and why we were applying. We were not told that we could have an attorney. I asked, can we get a lawyer? They said that time will come, and that this was part of the process. So they said, we're considering canceling your visas. You've got 15 minutes to think of a reason why not. And after about 4.5 hours of this, I'd had enough. I told them, look, I could see from your face and the way that you're talking and your body language that you are going to cancel our visas no matter what we say. So go ahead and do it. I was a bit upset at that point. We've just flown 34 hours.
And did they ever make it appear like you could be returned to Saudi Arabia or your transit country? I mean,
Yes.
And so did they say that could be a possibility?
They said yes. They're going to cancel our visas and then make a determination on our asylum claim on whether they're going to allow us to stay or not. And of course, that scared the hell out of me because going back to Saudi Arabia was not an option. So at which point, we went through this whole new process now, filling out paperwork, cancellation of visa. And then they put me in a holding area. I don't want to call it a cell because, I had a couple of beds in it and there was no bars. It was clean, a bit chilly, but it was fine. Then my partner came in to the same holding area. And next thing I know, about 45 minutes, an hour later, these huge men with tattoos that really looked like special forces people in a Serco company uniform. They handcuffed us and they walked us through the arrivals hall, through the baggage claim area at a time when there was also a flight from Dubai arriving. So we were two Arab guys in handcuffs being marched through the airport, which was humiliating. At which point we ended up being driven to Villawood Immigration Detention Center in Villawood, obviously. And that's where we ended up being put in detention for 2.5 months. And that's leaving out a lot of details.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And what the worst bit, I think, almost about your story, Sultan, is that in some way you were lucky in the sense that you got to Villawood. That's the lucky story. When you think of these Saudi women who got to that same point you did, but they were actually put back on their flights and didn't get the chance to get to where you are today. How does that make you feel?
Well, that could have happened to us, but from the onset, I told them I was a journalist. I told them I was rather well known in Saudi Arabia. All they had to do was Google my name. I worked for the Minister of Information. I was in charge of foreign media relations for Saudi Arabia for a period of time. So I have journalist friends, and I was a journalist. And people tend, especially in government positions, they handle journalists delicately. So we were not immediately put back on the flight and sent back to the Philippines, which was our point of entry to our last flight into Australia. So knowing that I had a bunch of journalist friends really, really, I think, helped our case throughout the whole 2.5 times we were in detention. But had I not been a journalist, I believe it's very possible they would have sent us back. Many people do end up at Villawood. They're put in a unit called the airport unit, which is actually quite nice. You're on your own pretty much and for 24 to 72 hours until a flight is found to put you back on. But from the moment I arrived in Villawood and I had my phone back with me, I was put in touch with Alison Battison from Human Rights for All, and she jumped on our case immediately.
Yes, amazing work that Alison does. Sultan, thank you so much. We do want your feedback to continue throughout the session, and I'm sure people will have a lot of questions for you. But Regina, I just want to go to you now because it's not just that entry screening that's traumatic and sees people potentially turned away, or someone like Sultan goes through what he did. There's also the fact that Australian Border Force sit at an airport like Hong Kong, for example, and basically try to hunt out potential asylum seekers. I learned about this firsthand interviewing two Saudi women this had happened to at Hong Kong airport in 2018. Just any other country hunt out about potential asylum seekers at transit airports like that?
There certainly are a number of countries that use airline liaison officers. So that's the title of the Australian officials who are at airports abroad. I'm sure that other countries do look for people who they might classify as attempting to travel, not for the purpose of their visa.
But for the purpose of specifically looking for potential asylum seekers. Have you come across that before?
Australia is quite aggressive in that. And I haven't come across it before. I do know that in terms of, how that sort of works with this entry screening process, one of the interesting things is that it actually is sort of finding people who have legitimate and strong claims to protection and actually putting them in precarious situations and sometimes returning them to harm. And that is obviously in contravention of a number of international obligations, but that's the opposite of what Australia's protection system is actually meant to do. It's also encouraging people to not to raise those claims at the earliest possible point. And that's sort of one of the interesting things here is that, in Sultan's case, he and his partner were almost penalized for raising that claim at the airport. I can't imagine sort of being in that situation, that precarious situation without access to a lawyer and trying to make this sort of claim and putting yourself essentially at risk of removal from Australia to a third country that's not even sort of your original country because you have a strong protection claim. That's perverse. And so one of our recommendations in the policy brief is that these entry screening procedures are not actually robust enough to identify people that need protection, and they're not actually robust enough to always offer the ability to lodge a protection claim to those who might need protection. So just because someone's lodged a protection claim doesn't mean that it's going to be granted, but Australia does have the obligation to review those claims and to find people who do need protection and offer that to them.
Senator Keneally, what's your reaction to hearing Sultan's distressing story?
It's a terrible story, and I'm really relieved at one level that Sultan and his partner at this moment have a sense of stability and peace, but yet not a durable solution. But what I'm more concerned about in a systematic sense is that when people arrive, when people even intend to come, we are making it difficult. We are looking to remove them, and as Regina says, at times we are potentially, or in some cases quite clearly, falling foul of our own non-refoulement obligations under international law. Sophie, I just think the extent to which Regina talked about a bit about having liaison officers in foreign jurisdictions and international airports, and at one level I can see the justification for that, because when you have things as we have seen in the last 4 to 5 years of a significant spike in people coming here by airplane to claim asylum, but yet to use that as a capacity to work for several years. In fact, in some cases, when they're being sent here by people smuggling operations with illegitimate claims to asylum, it would be really good if we had people overseas who were actually detecting that and disrupting it. And that would, in fact, allow for the capacity of people like Sultan, who have a clear and compelling claim to make for asylum, to be able to be assessed in a thorough and appropriate process. So I don't want to leave with the impression
No,
that
but I think that it's quite a separate issue.
Always a bad thing.
No, but if they're specifically, looking at two Saudi women by themselves, or Hong Kong, young Hong Kongers are arriving, and people are looking to see if they have any photos of protests, thinking perhaps they might claim asylum. I mean, it seems to go against the principles that we've signed up to under our international refugee obligations. I mean, so do you think that under a Labor government, Senator, you would get rid of the entry screening process and try and avoid those liaison officers specifically trying to hunt down potential asylum seekers in that way?
Well, I would not want any government, Labour or Liberal, to be hunting down asylum seekers with the purpose of trying to bar them entry or send them back into harm's way. We have made quite clear in the last election, in the last federal election campaign, that we would change and overhaul the assessment process. Things like, and while during the last election campaign, we hadn't specifically addressed this issue of airport assessments, we had made clear that the assessment process that has been used on board boats is one that lacks, in many ways, lacks due process. That the quick assessment system that the government has put in place, the fast track process, is neither fast nor fair. So I think that speaks to, while we haven't yet finalized all the policies it will take to the next election, I think it's quite clear that we have raised and will continue to raise serious concerns about the process as it stands. And of course, as we get closer to the election, we'll outline all of our policies in more detail.
Does it matter whether these procedures are set out in legislation or they're simply just a matter of policy? I mean, is that what's needed for them to be set in legislation? So they can't be, I mean, almost made up on the sly, it seems, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that you don't want a process detailed in legislation, but what you want are the rules for processing in legislation. So we don't want the actual, this box will be ticked and this person and that person, but rather the rules around the process need to be outlined, I believe, in legislation. Ultimately, though, even in legislation, it still can come down to the politics of the day and the decision makers that are in place. So, for example, legislation, as Regina points out, we've already legislated things around refoulement. We've already signed up to things around refoulement, but yet there are processes in place that actually skirt around it. And so I do think it also comes down to the politics of the day and the political stance of the party in government.
Regina, you do argue for legislation. So how could you implement such legislation and it not just be, circumnavigated or ignored completely, or still breaking international law? How do you do this in a way where it's actually effective?
$1 million question. So I think, like, in terms of our recommendations for entry screening, it has to be clear to officials at airports that they're not to make a determination on the protection claim. That's not their job, nor should it be, because they're processing a large number of people every day. So in terms of what the job is of actual border enforcement officials at the airport, it shouldn't be screening protection claims, period. If someone raises a protection claim, then they should be routing that individual to the appropriate process for an appropriate determination by an official that's actually trained in dealing with these types of claims. Because Australia has a long-standing and well-known protection system with lots of people with expertise in making these types of decisions. And those are exactly the people that should be making the decisions, not border force officials at the airport who have sort of operational and other pressures to sort of move people through a system. It's really important that sort of be divorced from that part of the process. And I do want to say too, just sort of jumping on that, I think that painting this as an issue of people seeking asylum, it sort of risks obscuring the problem that Senator Keneally's actually pointed to a couple of times, which is actually apparent across a range of migration categories at the moment, but that is of managing and administering a fair and efficient system for deciding applications. That is fundamentally what is needed in this space, is a system that is robust enough to identify claims of people who actually do have legitimate protection claims, and to give them the ability to lodge those claims so that Australia can be confident that it's actually meeting its international obligations. And I do think that legislation, as we've set out in the policy brief, is capable of doing that. It's capable of setting the parameters for people who are operating at the ground level within the system to give them some clarity about what their obligations are, because it frankly is confusing when you have a legislation that says that non-refoulement is not a consideration, yet you have a policy that says it is a consideration. You've also got mandatory detention legislation. You've also got legislation on visa cancellations, which prioritizes visa cancellations. So imagine being in that situation. What do you follow? It's a sort of mess of legislation that overlaps that actually allows for this type of gray area to exist where people are actually put at risk. And I think that cleaning up the legislative framework and making clear where Australia stands in terms of these values is critically important, and it's something that can be done.
And one thing that's actually really terrifying is that we don't know how many people this has happened to, how many, sultans there are out there, or young Saudi women who got to Sydney or got to Melbourne, wherever, and were put back on that plane, didn't get the chance to get through. I was speaking to a Saudi friend yesterday who said that they thought that since our program about young Saudi women, they hadn't heard of any young Saudi women being turned back. So that was incredibly pleasing to hear. And I like to think that, that Sultan's case went through a bit faster, perhaps because of the high profile nature of people, watching those particular cases. But, I'm quite terrified to think how many people this has happened to that we don't know about. Tell us, Regina, we haven't got much time before we go to questions, but could you talk us through how difficult it is to get data out of the department on this, and are they even collecting it?
I actually have to also commend Senator Keneally on this point, because I can't imagine sitting in estimates and asking questions and trying to get information. Sometimes it's actually, very frustrating even to read the transcripts. But in terms of the information and data that's collected, you'd think that it would be pretty straightforward. I mean, the government's provided information about the numbers of people that have applied for temporary protection visas as a result of entry screening, but the government has also admitted that it does not keep accurate count of the numbers of people who actually raise claims at airports. And the way that we would find that out is through numbers of people who've had their visas canceled for particular reasons, so raising a protection claim, et cetera, or the number of people who were screened out. It would seem like an important data point to collect, particularly for a department that likes to talk about evidence-based policymaking. So those are the kinds of things that we would be looking for in terms of trying to figure out whether the government is actually implementing this policy in a consistent way. And frankly, that information is just not there. So that is another piece of the policy brief that we suggest that the government does need to make sure that its data collection capabilities are accurately reflecting its obligations under legislation, not only for Parliament to be able to know what's going on, but for the Australian people as well.
And it was only through FOI that you managed to get a little bit of this, get them to clarify that they're not counting the ones screened out. So they're counting the Sultan. So there was 60, was it? In
I believe that was the latest number that I saw in estimates, was something like 62 people. It's always well under 100 in terms of people that have been able to lodge a temporary application, but we don't know how many people have been screened out or not screened.
Mm-hmm. A terrifying thought. Who knows where they are now? I know that the two young Saudi women were tracked down. The existence of their cases. They were returned to their transit countries, and their friends didn't hear from them again. So the presumption was that they had returned to Saudi, but had stopped contacting those friends because of the risk and the danger involved in that. So yeah, technically not non-refoulement in one way, because you're going back to the transit country, but if you have no option, then of course ultimately you often end up going back to your home country. I do want to make sure we have a lot of time for questions. So we are exactly on time, which I'm shocked to realize. But just to go first through for our questions, so they're all being voted on. So I think I have a little helper who's helped me sort through them. Regina, first one for you. How complicit are airlines in playing a quasi-immigration role? Should we also be raising questions about the role that airlines play in deciding who boards and who does not? I imagine many people do not even get through the check-in processes, says this questioner, who's a private question. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. So airlines, for quite a number of years now, have essentially had liability attached to it, if they transport someone to Australia who is ultimately refused admission into Australia, then they can be fined. And so they have quite the financial incentive to make sure that they're carrying properly documented passengers, et cetera. One of the problems with that, however, is that people who are seeking asylum don't always have the ability to get appropriate travel documents from the government that they may fear persecution from. And so one of the suggestions that we make in the policy brief is that Australia not penalize airlines for people who are ultimately found to need protection in Australia. So currently Australia penalizes every airline regardless, in situations regardless of whether the person is ultimately found to be owed protection. So we make the recommendation that slightly be changed so that airlines aren't penalized for people legitimately seeking protection.
Sorry to interrupt, but the airlines are playing a part in this. In that, my partner and I, we felt that we were screened in Manila. A particular sticker was put on our passports that our lawyer saw later, and she said that in her mind, that's how they were able to stop us here in Sydney, is that we were flagged already from Manila by Cebu Pacific Airlines. And I remember there was a bunch of kerfuffle about allowing us to get on the flight or not, because we did not have a return ticket from Australia. So we were already being screened abroad by the airline.
Thank you for that contribution, Sultan. That's fascinating. Yeah, I haven't seen it raised with the airlines before, and I know that when we covered the story of the young sisters in Hong Kong, I know they were standing at the Qantas desk being chased by the Saudi consulate, having booked new tickets after having their Emirates tickets cancelled by the consulate without their permission, and were standing at the Qantas desk purchasing tickets with these officials standing behind them, and the Border Force security officer there. And Qantas wouldn't allow them to purchase the tickets, despite the fact they were standing there with the valid visas. So, Senator, any reflections there on the airlines' contributions?
Well, no, not particularly on the airlines. Regina would be, and Sultan would have a more comprehensive answer than I would on that. I do think that there is a bigger issue though about travel documents, and Regina is right to raise the concern about that people may not be able to access travel documents from the regime from which they are fleeing. On the flip side, and I know I sound like a broken record, but I just, you can't get over the absolute upswing in the number of claims that have been made made on shore for asylum, and what that's doing to the entirety of our process and the quality of our processes. But there are a couple of jurisdictions where the Australian government has made decisions to grant electronic tourist visas, and that has fueled an upswing in people coming from those countries to come here and claim asylum with non-genuine claims. And again, it's just back to that point of, this is just the administrative burden and the quality of the decisions that are being made. We have a migration system, whether it's in asylum processing or in other types of visa classes, that is breaking down, if not broken.
But I guess it's very difficult. What do you do then? I mean, there's clear evidence that people who can apply for electronic visas from Saudi are using that system to claim asylum, because there's no other way, and they need protection. What are we going to do? Stop them applying for online visas, or
No. In fact, Sophie, I think what you need to do is take to be able to look at the data and make decisions. And this problem of people using a fraudulent claim for asylum to access work rights in Australia is not a new one. It has happened at various times throughout Australian history, modern Australian history, I should say. And when it has spiked in the past, say a couple hundred types of applications, the Department of Immigration has gone in and worked out what's going on. They've taken a country-specific or jurisdiction-specific approach. Right now, if you look at the data, it is undeniable that people are using electronic tourist visas from China and from Malaysia to come to Australia to lodge asylum claims when they are really coming here for work rights. In many cases, some of these people don't even know they've applied for asylum. And so it's about going into those jurisdictions. It's about looking at, and doing better screening of the people who are coming from those countries. I'm not saying that you can't come here on an electronic tourist visa. I'm saying if we are going to address the multiple problems that plague our migration processing system, one that has 300,000 bridging visas right now. That is a sign of a system in crisis. That has over 125,000 people who've arrived on shore in the last 6 years and applied for asylum. Again, a sign of just a massive blowout. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, it takes on more cases than it resolves every month. It is permanently in a backlog that is growing worse. Now, if we're going to resolve any of that, it's going to take multiple steps. And one of those steps has to be reducing fraudulent claims on the system so that the backlog does not continue to grow.
Regina, let's go to you. I mean, as part your research, is this problem of people claiming asylum, when they actually come here for work purposes, is there the evidence there to prove that this is what's happening as the Senator describes? I mean, have we got that research and that evidence there?
Look, I mean, there are certainly higher numbers of claims from people from Malaysia and China and lower numbers of approvals. That is absolutely supported by the data. I think that though there still are questions out there. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal reports about people coming to be trafficked, et cetera. But I think that the issue really, though, is in terms of making sure that the department actually has the resources and the abilities to make those claims efficiently. Because if you talk about people coming here for whatever reason, and they lodge a protection application, they shouldn't be waiting 3 years for initial decision on that protection application, period. I mean, it does result in long delays. It results in, regardless of what the person's individual circumstances is, it results in that person being in Australia for an extended period of time without certainty as to their future, which is not fair really to anyone involved. So I think that, tying it to the number of applications is, I think it's a bit dangerous to talk about it in those terms. But I do think that, there are a number of documented issues with the way that the department is processing and deciding claims. And there are a number of sort of points along the entirety of the process that are an issue. And in terms of, human trafficking and worker exploitation, I mean, if that's actually happening, then that needs to be a specific point that people are talking about in terms of providing protections to workers so that they can actually come forward and make complaints and support the prosecution of bad actors who are engaging in those types of behaviors. But I think tying that to the asylum system, it starts to sort of be a little bit of a like mixing things up in terms of the entry screening process. I mean, temporary protection visas, like people on temporary protection visas who are screened, first of all, you have fewer than 100 people every year that are being subjected to this process. So there's not some big, massive push of people trying to be screened at the airport in order to work. So I think that we just need to be clear about, okay, in terms of the protection system, the focus should be protection and efficiently deciding claims, making sure that those are done so that people aren't here for long periods of time if they don't need to be, and for people who do merit protection, that they're given protection and can get on with their lives and not be stuck, as the senator said, in these sort of like bridging visa situations where you've got these blowouts in huge numbers of people on bridging visas that can't actually plan for their lives because they don't know what's going to happen 3 years from now.
Yes, I think as I said before, we all agree that system's massively broken. But again, it's a separate issue. And if we spent the last 10 minutes we had talking about that, we wouldn't stop. So I want to go back to a question from the audience. What about good practice elsewhere that we could draw lessons from? What happens, say, in the UK when people might arrive at Heathrow and have an asylum claim, Regina?
So actually in Heathrow, the last time I was in Heathrow was a couple of years ago, and they've got signs everywhere that says that you must make a claim at the airport if you do want to seek asylum. I do know that where people do make asylum claims in other countries generally, so like the UK or Canada or even the US, which I wouldn't necessarily hold up as a bastion of best practice right now. But the UK in particular, people's claims are heard and processed. It's not like, oh, you raise a protection claim, we're canceling your visa and you're going to be put on a plane and returned somewhere. So there certainly are other places that Australia could look to in terms of these things. And I should also point out that having this type of expedited procedure that's not contrary to international obligations in and of itself. It's just how you do it. It has to be a robust system for identifying who needs protection and who doesn't.
Senator, have you examined other countries' systems and seen what you think works and what we could apply here in the future?
Yeah, look, I think back to the point I made at the beginning, those countries that ensure that asylum seekers have access to quality legal advice, their systems operate more effectively and efficiently and fairly. Those systems that set clear timeframes and report against their progress on those meeting those timeframes also do much better. And government decisions, I'm always of a view that government decisions should be made based on clear criteria, transparently, and be robust enough to be relied upon. When we have a system whereby mistakes are easily made either by the decision maker or the applicant, where we have multiple and confusing avenues of appeal through the AAT and lengthy delays, we just create all types of difficult circumstances and perverse incentives. The honeypot effect of being able to be here for 3 to 5 years is what leads other people who have malicious intent to use our asylum seeker system in ways that it's not meant to be made. The last thing I would say is when it comes to the backlog, there are other countries that have had a similar type of backlog, and they have taken a very much an approach of, the United States and Germany are two good examples of last in, first out, so that rather than start at the beginning of the backlog, the person who's been here 6 years already, start with the people who've arrived most recently, and because the people who've been here a number of years, you can work through their processes, but we need to apply a clear, effective process to stop the backlog from growing worse.
I'd like to go to Sultan. Sultan, you were never jailed in Saudi Arabia. I mean, how surprising was it for you to be first when you first were placed in Villawood? I mean, had you heard about Australia's?
No, not at all.
Yeah, so to tell us about that, that I guess personal reaction and how surprised you were to find this is how you were treated once you did get to Australia.
I mean, even with the research we did about Australia, we never really looked into, we had no idea about, people being arrested at the airport or, we had no idea there was offshore detention. We were absolutely shocked. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, I spent a few hours inside a prison cell, but that was during the interrogation. But to arrive in Australia and be handcuffed and be treated exactly the way that we feared being treated in Saudi Arabia was just, no words can describe it. It blew my mind. Really, it did. I did not expect that at all. It was just the most un-Australian thing I had ever imagined. I mean, my father told me years ago, he was a sailor and he came to Australia and he said, Australia's a great country. It's a lot like the United States with different kind of people. I don't want to say better or worse, but, different kind of people. And he made it seem like an amazing place where there was, democracy and freedom. And, being put in Villawood that first night, I mean, I was just asking my partner, why the hell didn't we go to New Zealand? So it was quite an experience. It was unfathomable.
And Regina, it's the case that someone like Sultan is actually penalised, isn't he, for the fact that he raised his claim at the airport. Someone's got a question here about that, asking about how people who get screened at the airport are only eligible for temporary protection rather than those who get through and make their claim. Could you explain to us, and that might be our last question.
Sure. This was actually something that was talked about when it was reintroduced, when temporary protection visas were reintroduced in 2014. The idea that sort of maritime arrivals would be treated in this way. There was actually also a discussion about air arrivals being treated in this way. And they call them in the memorandum, they talked about unlawful air arrivals. And what happens is that by canceling an air arrivals visa, they're actually constituting the unlawful status. So Sultan actually arrived lawfully. And then by having his visa canceled, then he becomes subject to mandatory detention and all of these other penalizing measures. And that is fundamentally the issue here, is that why is visa cancellation being prioritized when it's creating these problems? It's creating the unlawful migration status, basically, of the person. Why instead isn't the person being routed to lodge an appropriate protection application rather than increasing the vulnerability of the individual, which, and Senator Keneally mentioned this earlier about having access to legal representation, access to translators, et cetera, which is absolutely critical in this context for making a claim that's strong and that gives them, you know, the best chance for getting across their story. So certainly the way that the system is currently is sort of creating this penalization.
I think that's an excellent point to end on, and I'd just like to thank everyone for tuning in today on a day when it is hard to concentrate and I fear turning my phone back on, but let's just wish for the best. And I just want to say a huge thank you so much, first to the Kaldor Centre. They do such crucial work. There's no other centre like it in the country, and I don't know where we would be without the work that its researchers does. Regina, thank you so much. Your brief is an excellent contribution to this debate, and really appreciate all the work you and your co-authors do. Senator Kristina Keneally, thank you so much for participating. We really appreciate the fact that you know, someone who's as busy as yourself has made the time to, you know, not only participate but to debate and take questions. We really appreciate that. It's really fantastic. And to Sultan, I think I'm speaking on behalf of everyone here today to say, you know, apologies for how you were treated. We would, you know, we all here, I think, want to work to make sure it doesn't happen to other people like yourself. But we are so glad that you are here and for you to become.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad I'm here as well. Like I said, I'm one of the lucky ones, but there's thousands of people that are not so fortunate, and my heart goes out to them, and I really wish them all the best.
I think that's why we all do this work. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you joining, and please check out the brief that's on the Kaldor Centre website that Regina's written, and also the video that Sultan is in. It's a really powerful watch. Thanks, everyone.